late. Rachel just started the recording. Thank you for doing that. So good morning, everyone. We're here for our fourth Drinking Water Source Protection Rules Advisory Committee meeting for the new OWEB Drinking Water Source Protection Program. Our agenda is fairly straightforward today, so we'll go around and do introductions. This time I won't forget to have OWEB staff introduce themselves as I did last time. So we'll do introductions, I'll do a quick agenda review, and then we are going to dive right in to reviewing the current draft of the rules. We'll have a few breaks here and there and then space for public comment. So let's start with introductions. I'll start with RAC members first, and we'll go with who's showing up on my Zoom squares. So Stephanie, you're showing up first in terms of RAC members.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Reed. I'm with the Lincoln City Water District, the Public Works Director and City Engineer.
Thanks, Stephanie. Julie.
Thanks. Yeah, Julie Harvey, the Drinking Water Protection Coordinator at Oregon DEQ.
Daniel Weir.
Hi, everyone. Daniel Weir, Forest Program Manager with Sustainable Northwest.
Thanks, Daniel. Gabby. Oh, Gabby.
I'm Gabby Fajeda, and I'm a hydrogeologist with the Oregon Water Resources Department. Sorry, I might have misheard.
That's okay. No worries. John Wickersham, welcome back.
Yeah. Thanks. Hi, everybody. John Wickersham, Associate Director with the North Coast Land Conservancy.
Dan Brown.
Good morning, everybody. Dan Brown with the Environmental Protection Agency in the Oregon Ops Office, and I manage our forestry program.
Thanks, Dan. Steve.
Good morning, everybody. Steve Graper, Rhododendron Water Association.
Thanks, Steve. Michelle.
Water Project Manager with the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts.
Thanks, Michelle. And Kristen.
Hi, everybody. Fighting with Tech. Kristen Larson, Water Funding Coordinator with Business Oregon.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, in terms of RAC members, Lori Bell may be joining us, so we'll keep an eye out for her. And Anne from Port Orford is not able to join us, but was able to provide some written feedback for the meeting today. So we'll be sharing that here and there. So let's jump to OWEB staff. I'm Renee Davis, Acquisitions and Special Programs Manager at OWEB. Rachel, we'll go to you.
Hi, everyone. Rachel Thompson, Post-Fire Recovery Specialist and assisting with these RAC meetings.
Audrey.
Good morning. I'm Audrey Squires. I'm the Drinking Water Source Protection Specialist.
Robin.
Hey, everyone. Robin Meacher. I'm the Conservation Easement Specialist in the Oregon Ag Heritage Program.
And Eric Hartstein.
Hey, good morning, folks. Eric Hartstein, Policy Coordinator.
Thanks, Eric. And it looks like we have one observer on, so we do have a public comment period scheduled for 11:35 at that point. Other folks may jump on in the midst of the meeting. We'll ask folks right before we take the break at 11:30, any observers to let us know if they're interested in providing verbal public comment to the RAC. If so, great, we will do that at 11:35. If not, then we'll try to make some additional progress in terms of getting through the rules, unless we've already gotten to that point. So as I mentioned, we will focus our time today on reviewing the draft rules. So we'll jump right in. We'll have a first break, 15 minutes slated at 10:15. I would ask one of my OWEB colleagues to please remind me if I'm just chugging away and forgetting about the break. And then we'll have another break, 5 minutes at 11:30 to get organized in advance of public comment. So I think just logistically or agenda wise, anything OWEB staff to add before I do some framing about the rule revisions. Okay. So where we are with the draft rules. So you did actually see two versions. So you received a version of the rules on Monday, and then we sent an updated version on Wednesday that did add in some of the comments that helped inform where we are now with the current set of revised rules. And you would have seen in that some comments that flagged for discussion by RAC. RAC, we're interested in your feedback on. Audrey will be screen sharing kind of a live Word version that mirrors that, but we've actually popped some additional discussion topics in for today. So things we want to make sure that we have your feedback on, you know, were some of the clarifications sufficient with some of the rule sections, just some new updates about where we are with a couple items in terms of pending information. So it may look a little messy on the screen, but we're doing that to try to make sure we cover all of the necessary components. I mentioned that Anne isn't able to join. We do have some feedback from her, and that actually, I think Audrey has sprinkled throughout the rules that she'll be screen sharing. So I'll be kind of doing high level, walking us through the document. Audrey will be screen sharing, will be helping to flag where we have some of those comments, flagging discussion points. It truly will be a team effort as we are walking through different sections of the rules. So for example, you'll see a lot of updates to the protective instrument section that we spent a lot of time on. We'll have Robin chiming in with some components of that. Rachel will be talking here and there about some of the eligibility pieces. We will start at the top of the rule set to make sure you're grounded in the updates that were made to reflect the last discussion. We do hope to get through the entire rule set today. So my hope is that we can make relatively quick work of some of those review sections, and we'll take the time we need if you have further questions or clarifications that you're seeing that we need. We definitely would like to spend some time today on evaluation criteria. Right now we have a little bit of a placeholder with some XXX to fill in the blanks on some of those evaluation criteria. So would like to spend time there. As I look at my notes, I think that covers it today in terms of some of the foundational pieces. Again, OWEB staff, anything else we want to flag for RAC members before we open it up if they have questions? Okay. Hearing none from OWEB staff, RAC members, any questions, kind of overarching questions or discussion topics you would like to get on the table before we start the walkthrough? Okay. And let me know, I see there are some chats. Is there anything in the chat that we need to touch on? Nope. Okay. All right, so we will start screen sharing now. Audrey will help guide us through, and note that we really won't be able to see one another in the same way with the screen share. So feel free to use your hand raise button. OWEB staff, help me track that. Should be able to track it. And if you have a comment, we're not seeing hand raise, just holler and let us know that you want to spend some time on a particular topic. So can folks see this sufficiently well, or do we need a little bit of Zoom?
Looks good to me.
Good on my end.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so starting at the top, you'll see some track changes, edits in these early sections, and then some comments just noting where we had a new comment clarified something. So purpose section really didn't change other than clarifying the OWEB piece so that we could use that throughout the remainder of the rule set. In terms of the definitions, Audrey added in some comments here where we've inserted new definitions, where we've clearly gone through and done some alphabetizing. The RAC did have some feedback, for example, on holder. We had a more abbreviated definition there the last time. We went ahead and fleshed that out entirely. And then a few more, I think, as we scroll down, just a few more new definitions that we added in based on that very productive discussion of how do we structure the protective instruments section, what should live in protective instruments versus another section. So for example, the long-term management plan piece. And then really, I think trying to get clear on how are we defining protective instrument at the outset and as it relates to this program. And so I think, Audrey, are there any other definitions? And then Julie, is there anything below water supply or Audrey?
Nope, that's the end
Water
of the
system.
definitions.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Julie.
I just have one comment. If you go back, the drinking water source protection grants, that is the exact same name that OHA uses for their grant program. And I don't know if it's a problem or not, or if it will get confusing. So I don't know if I don't know if we care about that or not, but it's the exact same name that OHA uses for their grant program that's run with the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And so I don't know if we want to change it to something like Drinking Water Land Conservation Grants, or if we are okay with that. And it just basically becomes the OWEB, Drinking Water
Right.
Source Protection Grants, versus the OHA Drinking Water Source
Right.
Protection Grants.
Yep. Thanks for that. We'll look into that and see if we should just clarify by naming the agency or if we need to consider an overhaul. I've
Theirs
gotten
is
really
not in
attached
rule.
to
Yeah.
Okay. I've
Theirs
gotten
is
so
not in
attached
rule,
to
so you get it
DWSP.
first.
I know. Okay, thank you for flagging that. I didn't realize it. Okay. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, and can I add one more thing on that? That in that definition, instead of the board, it probably should be OWEB, because you changed it to OWEB up above. So same thing for that same definition.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, now I'm done.
Yep, thanks.
I just have a question on page 2, 6, item number 6, holder has the meaning to give it in ORS 271.715. Under A, it says construct, maintain, and operate service facilities in Washington or Clackamas County. Why is Washington and Clackamas County singled out? Why isn't it across the entire state?
I can't answer that question. I'll see if Robin has any insights about it. So it's a multi-part definition in statute, and I don't know why those particular counties are called out. Robin, any insights?
I don't know the history of how holder was defined in this statute and why they single out Washington or Clackamas County, but since we have to use the definition as described in statute, we're limited to that. But no, I don't know the history on this specifically.
And I think just to confirm, despite the fact that they're called out for sub 1, that doesn't preclude in the rest of the definition other locations. It is interesting, and I don't know what the legislative history is.
I mean, it wouldn't preclude as long as they met
Right, exactly, yes.
the definition in B.
Right. So Steve, if that's something you're interested in, we might be able to run down some legislative history on that and point you to it.
I was just curious why Washington and Clackamas County were singled out.
Yeah.
So it's not that big a deal because it does, the rest of the definition does cover the rest of the state, but I just was curious why Washington and Clackamas County were singled out.
Yep. All right, other questions on definitions or comments? Okay, seeing none, let's go ahead and scroll down. All right, so I'll just kick this off, and then Robin, I think maybe if you want to do the walkthrough. So thank you again for the great conversation on the protective instruments piece of the rules last time. Hopefully, and you'll see the kind of framing here, this is largely based on our last RAC discussion, and we would love to hear both overall from the RAC members' read of this. Does it help really get at the more focused intent with this section of the rules? And are there pieces that you still have questions about or think could use some additional clarification? So that's the overall framing. Robin, do you want to just walk through any thoughts, feedback on the particular edits that were made as Audrey slowly scrolls through?
Yeah, I think one of the overarching comments we heard last time was it wasn't necessarily clear in this section what was talking about specifics that needed to be in the document that was the protective instrument versus just requirements surrounding the protective instruments themselves and how they're kind of administered. So we hope that the adjustments made that clear. So in one, we are talking about specific requirements in the documents themselves. And then we did make a bit of a adjustment there just in sub B, that there was some commentary about wanting to make sure that there was enumeration of how the agreement or instrument was going to be protecting the drinking water source. And so we added that to kind of be more elaborative than just the objectives of the grant, because that could be pretty simplistic. And then moving down, a lot of this is just terminology that we noticed needed to be adjusted. And then we did make some changes in the what we call the instrument that will be used by OWEB when a fee acquisition is part of the grant. So we'll call this, it's still in, I'd say some, we're still making some adjustments to it, but the concept is essentially, rather than a conservation easement or something of that nature, OWEB would ask and require the grantee to record a notice. We're calling it a notice of grant requirements. That may change, but for now, that's what we're calling it. And we didn't really change much of what would be required in that. It's just essentially the same as the above, but rather than being the instrument that the holder or the grantee would be working with, this would just be the notice that's recorded to give notice to any future owner of the property. And then I don't think we made any other changes down there.
So questions about that? Any additional help me understand type questions that folks have? Michelle, go ahead.
Unmute. Caught it. Thank goodness for that flashing notice on Zoom. It's just a tiny thing on C sub 4. It says that the grantee will not assign or convey the protective instrument without the consent of OWEB or DAS, and just flagging that below when you talk about subsequent conveyance, you say and if applicable DAS. So my understanding is maybe DAS not involved in all of these transactions, so that if applicable might carry up to 4. So just a knit sort of thing.
No, that's great. Thanks for that consistency. Other thoughts or questions?
Audrey, I think she was talking about C4 also. So up above.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm trying to, I'm a little lost. Up here.
Yep, there
yeah,
you
you just scrolled past it.
So it's, yeah, C sub 4.
Oh, this.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it. So adding if applicable here.
Yep. Thanks,
Thank you.
Audrey. Kristen.
I'm not sure. So I'm not sure what number it is, but near the bottom when it says if grantee or holder in partnership with the grantee acquires fee simple title, Grantee or the holder shall record on title, that includes 1A through E above. So I was just curious, yeah, so that one basically points to everything up above. So why in number 1 do you separate a protective instrument other than fee title should include all these things, and then down below you say fee title should include all these things?
So essentially because fee title can't include this in an instrument. And so we're referring to the notice that would be recorded separate from the conveyance of fee title.
But in but fee simple is included in the definition of protective instrument, though?
Yes, and that's why we accept it in the requirements for. Essentially, and I think that this is a kind of a great thing to continue to talk about, is that our definition for protective instrument is broader and fee title is a little bit weird to include in that.
Yeah, okay.
But to make it read throughout the rest of the rules, it's when referencing, instead of having to call out every time and fee title, we did it that way. But I think it's a worthy of conversation.
Okay, I think just because I don't have an acquisition background, but then how, so below it's adding the part that the notice of grant requirements related to the fee title is what will include 1 through A. Is that the distinction?
Yeah.
That the instrument of fee title won't include these things, but the notice of grant requirements associated with the fee title will include these things. Is that
right?
The nuance. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I think this is a great place to flag. I don't know if it will entirely solve confusion like what Kristen experienced, and honestly that I experienced. And thankfully we have amazing folks on staff to help with that. We will have, as a companion, or I guess more like where the rubber meets the road with program stand-up, we will have grant application, program guidance materials, I-buttons within our online grant application. We will try to help clarify as this translates to something that an applicant would be engaging with in terms of a grant program. But if there are areas, and Kristen, like this was a perfect example where we on the side as OWEB staff might want to flag, as we are putting together those program materials, but once we complete rulemaking, we need to think hard about how to make this understandable for folks. So I would say just RAC members that as you have an eye to this, knowing we want to get down in rules, those pieces to really help define program structure. But if there are places where you think folks who are going to engage with this program are going to need some help understanding, and Anne flagged a few of those for us to please note those so we can have that running list on the side as we look towards program stand up and materials development. Okay, so any other comments on edits that were made to protective instruments? Okay, seeing, oh, go ahead, Michelle.
Ugh, Friday morning, sorry. On sub 3 is the only one that seems outside of the language. So that section's kind of a narrow to be, this is the language we're going to be including in the kind of recorded documentation. And sub 3 is the only one that remains that seems like that's not, I mean, it is included in the language above, but then this sub 3 is kind of an additional add-on, which I don't have a problem with the substance of it. I'm just flagging the location if the intention is just have that section be, this is what needs to be in the written deed language. And I may be thinking of this wrong, so.
is the sub 3 you're talking about the one that's highlighted? Just so I
Did
know.
I catch that right? Yeah.
No, the very bottom, numeral 3,
Oh, this one.
subsequent conveyances.
Got it. Okay. And your comment was sorry, now that I'm looking at a different one.
Yeah, no, just that this is, I understand the intention of this section was now to be describing language that must be included in the recorded deed restriction or conservation easement or the notice of grant. And that requirement of subsequent conveyances is in the language above that has to be included in that recorded language. But this just seems like a lingering kind of substantive requirement of the program generally. And I'm wondering if it continues to belong in this section.
Got it. Yeah. So, I think I'm hearing two things, that it could be redundant because it's stated, and that was intentional, was to be redundant, to make it clear that it was a like overall program requirement as well as something that would be required within the documents themselves. And then I think that it's great that you brought that up because we are like 3 is supposed to be, so 1, 2, and 3 are supposed to be just general requirements regarding protective instruments, not a requirements in protective instruments or the notice. So it sounds like it still reads a little confusingly. And so we can kind of still massage, I think, this section in terms of just flow. So I think maybe Audrey, if you want to just highlight subsequent conveyances and make a comment about like reevaluate how this section flows, I think we can clean that up. Or potentially move this into somewhere else as well. Does that help, Michelle?
Yeah, and maybe just my Friday morning brain. So if there's consensus in the OWEB team, it makes sense. That's can ignore that.
I think this is where having outside eyes is very helpful, though, because we've taken multiple runs at this. So we will look back at that. And I think to Robin's first point, though, we are in a few instances erring on the side of a bit of redundancy just to be as transparent as possible in the rule set about requirements. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the redundancy just because it's a little confusing. And so it's helpful to see. The one thing, if we're talking about subsequent conveyances, it might just be helpful to also identify, fee title. Like if the property is purchased by the water district or, the landowner in fee title, what that process is for potential, like if there is a future sale, what restrictions would come from that as well. So folks know when they're buying the properties, like you have to own and manage this in perpetuity, or if you don't, what restrictions need to be approved by OWEB for a future sale.
So Robin, definitely chime in here. And I may be misunderstanding Daniel, but we typically, in terms of like that level of detail, that is not something that's outlined in rule. That typically is in a grant agreement. Robin, I'm looking to see if that feels more detailed than what I'm thinking about in our other rule sets.
We do have, so specific to like conservation easement and fee and how those interact, we do, I think, have some statements that say that before fee can be acquired by a grantee, they have to go through a certain process, but I still think it's very high level.
And I do think high level is fine, right? I'm obviously getting down into the weeds a little bit more than maybe is necessary, but just having something to flag that, I think, would make it a little bit less confusing.
So for the comment I'm making, just to see if I'm understanding it correctly, Danielle, it's to make it clear to applicants whether or not they have to own the land into perpetuity, or if they could resell in the future.
Yeah, exactly. Just making sure, or, if we're calling out protective instruments to be transferred, or fee title proper, or the property and ownership if it's transferred in the future.
So does it help, Daniel, if just remembering that the definition of protective instrument is inclusive of fee title?
Yeah, that simple reminder might be the fastest way to get there.
Yeah, okay. Because it is, I think that is exactly the point of this, is that DAS will and OWEB will have to evaluate and then subsequently make a determination as to whether the transfer can happen. So of any of these, fee title or any protective instrument.
John, you had your hand up and then it went down. More to add on this?
No, I just was gonna pose a question. I imagine that if you're gonna sell or transfer the property, that it could only go to a qualified applicant of the program.
It's a great question. I think that is a good connecting of the dots, and that would have to be part of the review process, given initial intent.
I think it'd be weird if it got I don't know. That's what we see typically on other programs. It seems to make sense because it's still achieving the intent of the program.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great flag, John. Thank you. Yep. Thanks, Audrey, for putting that in. I think we can check back with both DAS and DOJ, and as needed articulate that. Okay. Right. Anything else on protective instruments? All right. Seeing none. Let's scroll down to eligibility. Not too many changes, and obviously under applicants or properties, just clarification or typo correction, really. We did get some feedback from Anne about public water systems. So I think you see the question in there. The focus to date really has been on intent of the program, I think, to benefit public water systems. And I think there were, maybe it was under Oregon, very small water systems, if memory's holding. I think Anne raised the question, could that could include potentially privates? And how do we make clear that the intent is public water system benefit with these funds? And so, Julie, we may lean on you here a bit.
Is the question, so community water systems, for example, can be publicly held or privately held, and we don't distinguish, and OHA doesn't distinguish like in the terms of grant programs and others. If it's a community water system, they're always eligible. And this program can choose to do that differently. And the same with Oregon, very small, that can be publicly held or privately held. And it's where we're distinguishing is down there in that the transient and the non-transient, non-community water systems, where we want them to be held by nonprofits, basically. So a public entity, so to speak, a nonprofit, not a not-for-profit entity. Just so that it's clear, those Oregon very small water systems are not federally regulated as a water system, but they are in our state rule. And I just grabbed it, so I had the number. Serve 4 to 14 service connections, and at least 10 to 24 people, at least 60 days of the year. So it's the same as a community water system, but a lot smaller, is what those are. So I think that by saying public water systems as defined by, OAR 333061020, we are capturing that.
Okay. Yeah, and I
Add
think
some
that
clarity. I think one of the things, Robin and I talked about this a little bit. We say public, but then we say as defined, and these have definitions that include other than public. So would an applicant look at this and be like, well,
It's
if
the
you're saying as
definition of public.
defined,
Yeah. Gotta look and see. It's the definition. Public water system is defined as all four of these types of water systems in the OAR. So a public water system, it means it serves the public. And then what we are distinguishing down below is sort of how it's held, how that public water system is held. And so I guess I always think about that public being capitalized because a public water system is in the definition by the health authority. And then we're distinguishing down below sort of how if they're held by a private entity or a so to speak, a public entity with that nonprofit. And what this is throwing out here is those that are held, this is like when Intel runs their own public water system for their plant, we're saying they're not eligible to purchase land because we don't want to be supporting private for-profit businesses with public dollars.
so a question, given what you just described, Julie, and I think the issue that Anne raised, and it's going to just be another area where we're really trying to cover it by being redundant. Do we actually create a standalone A with the statement of the program is intended to benefit public water systems, then a new sub B that points to where those are defined so that there isn't any confusion?
We could, yeah. I'm just gonna look and see if there was a definition for public water system. I'm sure there is.
Well, Julie's looking. Go ahead, Kristen.
Can you do, in spirit of redundancy, an ineligible applicant is a public water system that is privately owned? Because the definition of public water system is confusing in that sense. But sort of what Julie said is that even if you serve 15 or more connections and but you're privately held, you are ineligible, and sort of doing the flip side to the eligible. I mean, in addition to the federal water systems are not eligible. Julie, would that be something that could be stated? Sort of counter.
Well, and what we might want to do is, I'm looking for the chat. I'm going to pop in the chat the definition of public. Here it goes. There we go. Paste the full definition of a public water system. And so we could say, just like you said, that to be eligible, you have to be serving you have to be an eligible water system includes public water system, public water systems under, 333061020 and then there's the definition there, and then the following public water systems. So if you want to break it into two segments, that would be very clear.
Yep.
Where'd you pull that, Julie? The one I'm looking at online is its definition 109.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I Googled it. So,
but it's still the
yeah, we'll find it.
Yeah, okay. I just want to make sure I'm looking at. But I think,
and I might not have gotten the most recent one from
OHA puts the PDFs up and
I know I'm in the OHA. I'm in the OH and I'm in the OHA PDF, and it might have changed. So
I think it has. So online it's 109, but yeah,
okay,
it's the
perfect.
same
Thank you.
thing. Okay.
All right, so if with that addition, referencing the most current version, and knowing that some of this is in response, obviously, to a comment that Anne had, but it connects back to the last RAC discussion about interest in focusing this on public systems, would that revision be something that folks are comfortable with to just be as clear as possible? Adding in the public water system definition, still maintaining the content that we have, but just kind of layering that clarity. Any concerns?
One question, in reading the public water system definition, it does appear that it includes supplying water to a commercial establishment.
And it does.
So, and I know that like Anne's comment, her example was an RV park. And so like whether we wanted those included. So I'm just wondering if this, it's nice to add the definition, but I'm wondering if it fully solves.
Right. It's an and situation. It has to be a public water system as defined here. And it has to meet these criteria that are currently in A, the 1 through 4.
So it
It's
would
not an
also
or.
end up excluding Oregon very small water systems then, because it looks like at the end of this definition you shared, it does not include Oregon very small water systems.
It does because it serves 3 or more service connections. And
Oh.
so Oregon very small serves 3 or more. The federal definition is 10 or more. So the OVS are in this definition here.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think this is an area where I'm not certain of it, but this is definitely newer space for OWEB. So it could be that in program guidance, we want to work with DEQ and OHA to help be as clear as possible on kind of who's in and who's out, given that and.
Yeah. And Kristen is right. We'll definitely want to go grab the definition from the newest set of the rules, because I see at the very end there, it says state regulated water system. And in the newest version, that a health authority has changed that to Oregon very small water system. So those are comparable terms. And that is the new definition, is that Oregon very small. And so that's why you missed it, Audrey. And it's that change in definition. Yeah.
Okay, great.
That's what happens when you're trying to do stuff on the fly.
I know.
You don't go to the real rule. You go to what's posted by the health authority.
Exactly.
In that same section, can I think that number 2 should be federally owned water systems. So that I just want to, while we're just on that section, I think we should add the word federally owned water systems there.
Thanks for that, Julie. Gabby, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask on that 1B under eligible systems for tribal water systems, does DEQ's drinking water source assessments include tribal water systems?
No.
Because that definition points back to DEQ certification. So
we do not. EPA oversees tribal water systems or works with them. And you're right, that drinking water source area. I was going to go look at the definition there again.
Yeah,
you're right.
I would point back and require DEQ certification, and that might kind of contradict that eligibility there. And similarly,
Good
in that
catch.
Source area definition, I noticed the groundwater supply drinking water source area on the surface that directly overlies has been certified by the authority. Is that DEQ 10 to 15 year time of travel? Is that what would be considered the source area for groundwater supplied?
That is correct. And in that definition, the authority is OHA.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Defined earlier in their definitions in that OAR.
Perfect.
So you're right. It should probably be, what I almost want to say is tribal water systems with their own delineated source area and assessment, maybe.
Yeah, maybe not linking back to
that term that we've defined earlier. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good catch.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Gabby. So is that sufficient to just be a bit vague on the tribal of their own delineated? Or I think Dan Brown in particular, I would ask you, is there something that a connection with EPA, a direct tribal EPA connection that we should be referencing there?
I can follow up.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Daniel.
Another thing I wanted to flag that I think Gabby mentioned too is in terms of eligible properties, that section 2, it says eligible properties must be within a delineated groundwater or surface water drinking source area. I know we had conversation about, whether that has to be in part or in full, because some of the willing sellers might have a certain parcel they're going to sell either way, and it's not guaranteed to just be the drinking water source area. So I think that having a little bit of flexibility of like, as long as it's comprising, and you do a good job of it in the eligible properties above, but just making sure that it's not only restrictive to the drinking water source area, because that might scare off folks willing to sell, because it's more work on their end to break up their properties.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I think Eric Hartstein, it would be good to have your thoughts on this. As I read that, I think as long as a portion, majority, not 100% is within, but Eric Hartstein, as you think about rule interpretation, any concerns there that might prompt us to more clearly state what Daniel's getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly broad right now, and it could be interpreted that, loosely, that a property that touches a delineated water source area would be eligible. And then as you get down into the application requirements and evaluation criteria, that's where you would be able to kind of suss out the real benefits of this potential project. But I'm curious, Daniel, do you think there should be maybe additional language here in the eligible properties that makes that clearer?
I mean, I think that could be helpful under the second bullet, and what's listed here versus how it's interpreted, but potentially two different things. So just something as simple as in part or in full under that second note, could add the flexibility that someone might be worried about.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay, Robin.
Going back to the edits we made for tribal water systems with their own delineated source area and assessment, do we also want to make an edit to eligible properties, since we're defining those as within these specifically defined areas that we just adjusted for tribal?
Yep. Yeah, good catch.
Okay.
Whole one thread and lots of other things are affected by it. All right, Dan Brown, you are unmuted. Did you have something else you wanted to share?
Nope, I just haven't remuted myself, but I will.
You don't have to. We're not getting any background noise. I just wanted to make sure we weren't missing something.
You're not getting any more background noise yet.
Okay, so thanks for the discussion around tribal systems. Really helpful there. The in part or in full, good clarification. And that is something, again, in program materials, we will help folks to understand. Please don't come in with 1% of the drinking water area with your project. I'm not saying we'll attach a specific quantity to that, but just helping to signal expectation here as part of likely performing more strongly relative to the evaluation criteria. Kristen.
I'm not advocating one way or another, but just a question on regarding the tribes, if it needs to be or a consideration of federally recognized tribes or any tribe and their water source. And I'm not sure how that works, but yeah.
Yeah, Eric Hartstein, currently, in terms of grant eligibility, is it the 9 federally recognized and NESPERS? I'm not remembering.
Yes, and if a other tribe is a nonprofit of some sort or is eligible in that way, that there's avenues for non-federally recognized tribes in Oregon to be an eligible grantee.
And is that in Division 5? I'm just not remembering.
Yes, because they can fall into some of the other eligible
Okay.
entities.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.
Robin?
Kind of along those same lines. So the way we have tribal water systems written, it suggests that it's a defined term, or it's capitalized with tribal and then water systems, which is also a defined term that talks about. So I'm just curious if we're confusing it by suggesting that tribal water systems are a defined term in some space, and if they are, we could add that definition above in the definitions. If they're not, we might want to just consider reconfiguring how it's written.
Yeah. Yeah, Dan Brown, can we plan? I know we were going to follow up anyway. Let's connect on if there is an existing definition that we could draw from, and if not, to Robin's point, I think being clear, because we capitalized tribal, I believe, in all of our rule sets. So just being clear on what it's pointing back to.
Affirmative.
Thank you. All right, any other comments, questions on eligible applicants, eligible properties, eligible systems? Because if not, we'll get into the first part that we didn't touch during the last RAC meeting. So this is very exciting. Okay. Hearing none. So eligible maximum funding request. So in statute, it states that a grant request cannot exceed $3 million. That does not preclude the agency from setting a lower maximum funding request cap if it makes sense. Certainly, land acquisition related to source water protection could warrant a $3 million grant application. And at present, we have $5 million for the entire program. And we don't know if there will be future funding and what the magnitude of that funding might be. So we would very much like the RAC's input on at a minimum, we would need to put in $3 million because that would align with statute. And what are your thoughts on a different, potentially lower number as you think about just program uptake overall?
I would lean into the conservation folks on the phone because they know what property is currently going for and what the needs are probably better than we do.
John?
Well, this is a little bit of a tough one. It's like, I mean, I think you could argue 3 million would be a good price. I mean, we live in the area with the most expensive timberland in the world, which mostly what we're buying is for these properties. I mean, but it would be nice to see more than like two projects go to, right? So, I think you could argue for probably about a 2 million cap, 1.5 million cap, or something around that area.
And one piece that I failed to mention, Daniel, I'll get to you in just a second. To your point, John, one thing that we work hard at OWEB not to do is when an applicant brings in a project for a certain amount, we don't then, like after the review process, start a negotiation of, well, we actually could give you $1 million instead of the 1.5 or 2 or 3 million that you requested, because that is a great way to result in incredible upheaval as folks have defined what they're going to be doing with their project. And then all of a sudden they're thinking, how would we make up a gap that we had never anticipated as we put together a proposed budget with an OWEB ask and match. So wanted to just provide that context. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I agree with everything John said. You know, it's a bit of when we were talking about this initially is, you know, the hope of this program is to be able to leverage federal funding. And so I think that certainly there are projects that could apply for all 3 million, you know, and if you were to raise it to 5 million, there are projects that could apply for all 5 million. But if we aren't, there's no guarantee that there's going to be multiple years of this. It would be helpful to see a funding level where we could have multiple projects truly supported. And whether it's, you know, I think the example I think about is like, you know, the Forest Legacy Program federally has a 75 or 25% match. So if it's $2 million, you could leverage, turn it into $8 million, kind of one of those things. Not that, and there are other options. So I guess all that to say, between $1 and $2 million, I think could be a good level to make sure that we get multiple projects through this pipeline.
Michelle?
I don't have a substantive answer to build on, but I was curious, thinking about whether this belongs in rule or if there's a way to put that in guidance that would allow for flexibility going forward in terms of if there is additional funding, if it's an increased amount of funding that would accommodate projects of 3 million and looking into the future kind of changes in property value. And I don't know how OWEB has done that in the past. And I guess that's a question of, is there a way to put a $3 million cap in rules so it's consistent with legislation and then build in a lower cap to kind of get at getting more projects in the door this time? Anyway, and those are just questions I'm posing and I don't have an answer to any of those. So.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. Steve, I'll get to you in just a minute. I want to follow up with Eric Hartstein. So at a minimum, we would need to build into rule a maximum of $3 million to align with statute. As Michelle said, to my knowledge, we have set a cap in a few grant programs in rule, and otherwise we're silent on that unless possibly in guidance. I can think of FIP and small grant. Eric Hartstein, isn't that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, yeah, something like a may not to exceed language, 3 million would then provide flexibility to go lower in guidance if that's the way we wanted to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. Steve, go ahead.
Is there opportunity in looking at Daniel Weir's comment that there are systems that could use the full 3 million and there are systems that could use 5 million? Is there opportunity for systems to apply in separate years? I mean, in year 1, they could get 1 million. In year 2, they could get another million. Is that a possibility, or is that not a possibility?
It's a great question, Steve. I don't know that I have an answer for that yet, because I don't know that we've thought through exactly the implementation of this. And I guess the other question, and I'm genuinely not trying to avoid answering, but I would say, Steve, for you, Stephanie, Daniel, John, as you're thinking about how the structure of these deals works, is that viable? And I guess too, Steve, let me say this, Steve. I'm thinking about a single piece of property, not as a water supplier is finding an opportunity here and then a different opportunity with a different parcel over there. Certainly that could come in subsequent years as new opportunities pop. But as I think about if there's, I don't know, 150 acres and you come in one year to try to get $1 million for part of that, and then the next year, another $1 million for an additional part of that same 150, I don't know functionally that is possible from a transaction standpoint, but I would look to transaction experts to respond to that.
Well, I think the way that these deals are mostly structured is, I mean, there's going to be two ways. Either it's owned by a big timber company and you're going to try to go after it all at once, or you've got a lot of small owners in your drinking watershed. And most likely it's a combination of both. But typically what we've seen is just, mostly owned by big timber, and you could probably buy like 800 acres at a time if you could afford it. And so, but it would make sense, as Steve was saying, coming in subsequent years, say you could buy from 2 individual small owners at once. You show you're successful, and you come in the next year for two different ownerships.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. Steve, go ahead.
Well, okay, let's just take an example. For instance, if we had a maximum funding eligibility of $100,000, say, okay, and a property costs $200,000, a source water protection costs $200,000, but the maximum funding request is $100,000, and a water system took out a loan for the $200,000 to buy the protection, could that water system apply for $100,000 in year 1 and then the remaining $100,000 in year 2? That's so that their full $200,000 purchase is covered. I mean, and I'm just using $100,000, $200,000 as round figures as an example, but if one source protection exceeds the maximum funding request, are they able to get the remaining balance of that request in another year? That's all the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. John?
Yeah, Steve, I think that some of that would go towards what are the match requirements, right? I think if you have a $200,000 property, you don't need match. You would just apply for the full 200,000 if you could get it. I mean, or it goes to like what's the top funding, right? So I think setting it at is like a higher limit of what we think projects will come in would be the best bet, or just putting a general guidance not above 3 million, and then there's guidance further down about generally this is the sort of the cap that we're looking at. But not putting a hard cap on it might be worth it. I don't know if that answers your question, Steve, because like if you put a hard cap on 3 million, like could you come back in the next year and your property was 4 million? Could you come back in for $1 million the next year? I think is kind of the question.
Yeah, thanks for that dialogue. And so you'll see matching contributions is the next topic for us to tackle. And those things absolutely are interconnected. I think, and Eric Harcine, again, I want to check this. I do think it is possible to set something as high as 3 million in rule, if that is the inclination of the group. We could in guidance then give folks maybe a more reasonable range to aim for. Another piece, and we did this with the emergency funding for post-fire recovery in 2020, is helping in guidance to signal there is some interest in having this program benefit multiple locations, to send the message of please avoid coming in for nearly the entire funding that's currently available, because of the reality of other needs being out there. It doesn't stop someone from doing that entirely, but I think just trying to send some of those messages around letting a few locations benefit where possible and recognizing that there is limited funding currently. But Eric Hartstein, anything that you heard in that from a rulemaking and then subsequent program guidance development standpoint concerns you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, it provides, I think, flexibility moving forward within the program. Having that not to exceed language and then kind of strongly suggesting in guidance, particularly with the the initial amount of 5 million, that you're gonna need to come in much lower, I think would be appropriate. And as the program develops and if there's additional funds provided, and maybe in the future, a $3 million request wouldn't be out of line.
Yeah, one other thought, and this isn't necessarily for us to tackle and rule, but just in terms of OWEB, thinking through and understanding the practical nature of the deals on the ground. I think, Steve, with the example that you gave about 100,000 first round, but knowing it all told is 200,000, take out a loan for the other 100,000, hope to come in next time. I think just the question becomes, we don't know what future funding for the program will look like. So I think just helping to be mindful of that introduces uncertainty with that strategy. And so we're sensitive to that, but unless and until we better understand what biennial allocations might be for the program over the long term, I think we will need to operate in a space of uncertainty a bit in working with applicants to the program. Okay, so I think what we heard, and Audrey captured, not to exceed 3 million, and that meshes with the statute, and then describe in guidance potentially a range to aim for. Again, not saying that is hard and fast, and then providing though that flexibility that you all were interested in. Okay, any other feedback on this? Okay, seeing none. We have about 6 minutes left. Are folks comfortable with jumping to matching contributions since they are related before we take our break? Okay. So you'll see here that the primary space in which we're interested in your input is what should that match level be? Historically, OWEB has required a 25% match. Just, I think it was last year. Is that right, Eric? We did actually go through rulemaking to update Division 5 rules saying that match level could be set for each individual grant offering in a way that makes sense. We have to have at least $1 of match, if memory holds. Yes, Eric's nodding, by statute for each program. So we are really interested in your thoughts on a reasonable match percentage. And I would say kind of the competing interest might be what Daniel mentioned. I think this funding was intended to help leverage federal funding. So showing that there's some other skin in the game, and we are sensitive to, if we set a certain match amount for a small water supplier, that could be really tough potentially to get to. You'll see in sub 2 what qualifies as match. So it's not just cash. It can be in-kind contributions from a local water supplier, but just, I think, balancing interest in leveraging other funding and not having a match percent be so high that it's going to include opportunities for smaller, more resource limited systems to come in. So thoughts from RAC members? Kristen?
Two questions, really. In the 2A, is there OAR that defines in-kind match, or is that going to get developed in that? And then second question, under D, I was curious, and again, this might just be ignorance on my part, funds deposited in a stewardship fund before the OWEB funds are released for acquisition of the covenant or easement, and why that's specifically calling out just covenant and easement and not fee title or anything else. Does that not just say protective instrument or whatever? So those are my two questions.
So in response to the first question, that will tie down to whatever the OAR number, I believe, will be for the use of funds, as we define it in the program. And then the second one, I think, Kristen, you just caught something that we missed when we ported over from other rules, but Robin, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, I think we had intended to take out all of D, not just the covenant or easement, but I think we were taking out all of D, right?
Oh, right, because stewardship, that's exactly right. Thank you for that. Yes, because stewardship is not an eligible bond cost. Yes. Thanks. Daniel.
I think there are two Daniels, but I'll jump in first here.
Well, I
guess
usually call Dan Brown,
Dan.
not Daniel Brown. So
yeah, I compared this program development to the Washington State's RCO Community Forest Program, and for reference, they have a 15% match. So take that as you may. I think that's a little bit lower than the standard OWEB 25%, but still there's enough skin in the game that there's clear effort for fundraising going on.
okay, thanks for that. Dan?
Yeah, I keying off of what you said earlier about how some of these municipalities in their ratepayer base just might not be able to afford the match. I was wondering if that's why paragraph 3 is included here about the OWEB director's retention. And if we wanted to sort of emphasize that point in this paragraph, I wondered if this is just for consideration, if in that paragraph you could say something along the lines of, in making such a determination, a director may consider information provided in application requirement 8B down below. That's where there is a request for information on like the ratepayer base and their ability to pay. So it would be a way to sort of balance, hey, we want to see a big match, and we do have some discretion to consider that. I don't know if that's an option or not, but I figured I'd throw it out.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. Eric Hartstein, I'm interested in your thoughts. My inclination is to say, rather than turn it into a discretionary decision, rather than aim too high on match and then be in a situation where we're evaluating case by case, my inclination is to say we should set it reasonably low so that we're not introducing subjectivity into the evaluation. But Eric Hartstein, is there any, I'm not thinking of another program where we've done that, but is there one that looks more like what Dan described?
Not to my knowledge. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Julie and then John.
And I'm just wondering if, you set a lower match, but then in the application process, give additional points for projects that provide local funds. So do you handle that through the evaluation process as opposed to a set match that's required?
I would say we have worked hard to get away from just using match, because we have seen in the past, and this is harking back, where folks would pad their match. And the way we get at it is more in kind of cost benefit analysis based on the cost of the project, the overall cost, and what we're seeing by way of kind of ecological outcomes. And I'm talking more about kind of our historical programs, really thinking about like, what is that benefit, doing it kind of more in that way, instead of just it being like a simple dollar bottom line, which can be misleading.
Well, and that could dissuade disadvantaged communities as well. Right. And that's part of our objective as a state and as a funder to make sure that we're considering those that are underserved and disadvantaged.
Yeah. And so Julie, help us remember that when we are down in evaluation criteria, that piece. Okay. John and then Daniel.
Yeah, I think a lower match is better. Obviously, I think that, you know, lots of the federal grants that you would imagine people going after for these are super competitive. So if you're looking at a forest legacy project, I mean, those are big, expensive projects that, you know, focus more than just on drinking water. So it's going to be hard to even find that match, I believe. And so lots of districts that we work with, I would like to consider even like gray infrastructure upgrades to their water system as like a potential match to this. I think looking at this more holistically, that doesn't stop at the intake, but like investment in their whole infrastructure. I mean, this is just another piece of that. So I'm just thinking of ways that we could actually realistically get districts to come up with match that's feasible for them.
Okay, that's great. And Julie and Kristen, given what John just described about that kind of broader view of match, which we would have to think through, because clearly it's more bound as it currently is articulated below. Do any of the DEQ or Biz Oregon programs have something comparable to that, where it is like taking the whole system picture into the context of how the project fits, that we could kind of look to, just as how would you structure something like that that is outside of just the transaction itself?
I haven't really seen that. I would say in like the Clean Water SRF, they have a sponsorship program where you can do a non-point source project and it reduces your interest rate on your Clean Water SRF loan, for example. So that's a way to bring something in, but I don't think it's not a direct analogy to what you're talking about, but that might be one way that you sort of frame it.
Yeah, and since the Biz Oregon SRF, drinking water SRF, and water wastewater are financing, so they're loans, low interest loans and forgivable loans, and then there aren't match requirements. We ask, you know, what is the water systems contribution, if any, and then it's mostly framed in terms of meeting an affordability rate, like showing your user rates are such that you are charging what they've deemed an appropriate amount to be contributing to the water system maintenance and upgrades, but not a match requirement. Julie, for the drinking water source protection grants, I'm not familiar enough with a match requirement on those.
There's no match.
Okay.
There's no match.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So I can't help you with that.
Okay. Thank you. Daniel, you had your hand up.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that it might be a little bit disconnected, but the Clean Water State Revolving Fund loans, if I'm not mistaken, they're forgivable for underserved kind of communities that meet income thresholds as well. So maybe that could be something where there's a match requirement unless you fit a waiver, kind of income level type waiver. Because I know that's a priority, like Dan was saying, in 8V or whatever it may be, that we're already looking at supporting the kind of underrepresented, underserved communities as a whole.
Kristen?
That's a really interesting idea. I guess I'll just offer a couple things. I personally in favor of a lower match requirement, thinking about who these applicants are going to be, and they're in many ways not traditional grant management outfits. I mean, they're managing financing things, but it's just one more challenge sort of in their way to this. But I know you want to see skin in the game and things like that. And then just as a side note, so for the drinking water SRF program, the Safe Drinking Water Act has the state define what is a disadvantaged community, and Business Oregon and OHA are currently working through. So there is a definition right now based on median household income, and they're working through updating that definition. It'll take the better part of this year, but if you wanted to go this waiver route for match, you know, there is a definition in one realm in the drinking water world of disadvantaged community under that program that it exists and will probably change at some point in the next year.
Okay. Thanks, Kristen. Steve, and then I think we'll put a pause on this to take a break since we're behind. But Steve, go ahead.
So help me understand this matching contributions. And let's take my example as a perfect example. We purchased an equitable servitude for $175,000. When we're done with the rules, Rhododendron Water Association is going to be going after repaying our loan that we got for $175,000. Is this matching contribution saying that we're going to have to pay a portion of that $175,000 and that we would not be eligible for the full $175,000 because we have to pay a matching contribution? Or because we're an underserved community, would we be exempt from a matching contribution? And where does the interest that we've been paying on our $175,000 loans fall in eligibility for a matching contribution?
Yep. So I would say that every applicant coming in the door for this program will have to, at a minimum, provide $1 in match, because again, that is in statute for the agency. Two, I think to your point, Steve, and this is where the sub A, in-kind contributions to activities listed under. So that is basically the eligible uses of the funding. And so things like Rhododendron Water Association staff time, or sorry, board time to get to a transaction, legal costs that you may have paid to get to a transaction, like once the parcel is identified, like those would be eligible match contributions. And I think to your point and what Kristen is saying and Daniel, I do think we need to think hard about how high we set this match bar, because we don't know the universe entirely of folks coming in the door, and the higher we set it, it could be more challenging. So I think those are important considerations.
And what about the interest that we're paying on the loan?
And if memory holds, and OWEB staff confirm, for the general fund, interest is an eligible use of funding, which would then crosswalk to it's an eligible in-kind contribution. But correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel or Robin or Audrey or Eric.
So if for example, our $175,000 loan, we paid $10,000 in interest, then I could come after $185,000 grant and pay the $1 match.
So I'm not going to say you can pay the $1 match because we haven't set what a match level would be for the program. But Audrey, will you just briefly scroll down? I'm not going to have us go down this path entirely, but I want to connect this down to the eligible or the uses of funds. I can't remember what section that is. Here you go. Okay, let's just go down to general fund because of the loan repayment issue.
And we can take this up after break if we want. Yep. I don't want to break into the break.
Yeah, so we have, and this is where I think it'll be important to just like flag this for folks, is down in this section, this is where the identified eligible uses of the costs are, and then that crosswalks back up to the match funding. So it will be important to think about those things in tandem. So let's pause this for now. Are folks okay with taking a 10-minute break to 10:36? rather than 15? Okay. All right, so we'll come back at 10:36 and pick up more of the batch conversation. Great discussion so far. Thank you. All right, folks, thanks for the relatively quick break. All right, we have critical mass now coming back. So on the match conversation, so let me ask this, would it be helpful to not dive deeply, but take a closer look together at the use of grant funds so that it's clear what that tieback is to match or not?
I think so. It all sort of wraps together and maybe we move forward and then come back and revisit this.
Yeah, okay. All right, so, yep, thanks, Audrey. All right. So, and the reason I say not dive too deeply, because I think what we would like to do for the purpose of informing the match conversation is give you a flavor of what eligible costs are for grant funds. We have had to bifurcate this because of two fund sources, lottery bond and general fund. And lottery bond has some things that you are not able to do. So my inclination is to say, let's take a peek together at the general fund section so that you have a sense of the diversity of actions there. But OWEB staff, if you disagree, please flag that and let me know.
Renee, just a point of clarification. If an applicant or grantee is receiving solely lottery bonds for their grant award, can their match be items that are more broadly eligible within general funds?
I think the way that it's currently written, it would crosswalk to the fund source, but I think it's a good question, Audrey, because that the match decision discretion should sit with us at the agency.
Okay.
Yep.
I think, yeah, ideally we would want that flexibility for people to be able to use all of these things, because that's what's going to come to us, is that they can only get funding for that and then they can use all of this extra stuff as match.
Yep. So Audrey is showing the general fund portion. And so you'll see things like purchase price, interest on bridge loans, staff costs incurred as part of the overall acquisition process, due diligence, cost of baseline preparation, legal fees specific to the project. This is not legal fees generally for the water supplier, it's specific to the project. Closing fees. Again, not, it would include things like title insurance costs. This is not broadly kind of general operating costs for the water supplier, and then indirect. So fairly comprehensive set of costs that would be eligible in this case for general fund use, and that would tie back to the matching funds. And so I think, like Steve, to your question about, you know, what are those pieces for rhododendron, which is a great, I think, example of a smaller water supplier and the kind of skin in the game in terms of costs that you all have put in. So I thought it would be helpful to maybe ground us in that as we're thinking through matching funds. And my inclination is probably for us to err on the side of lower. I'm not necessarily saying $1 lower at this point, because there is some space for these other in-kind contributions, but I don't think this program is served well necessarily based on all that you've said by coming out of the gates with a 25% match requirement. I think Daniel's example of Washington having 15 is just a helpful reference point. And maybe even that is too high. And I guess one thing I would add, I think from an agency preference, it would probably be simpler to be clear from the outset what a match fund level is rather than setting up a kind of waiver or exemption process at the outset until we better understand the program. I would prefer that it's as clear as possible around what folks are aiming for. So any questions about the eligible uses of funds piece before we pop back up to the match funding section? Michelle.
It may be applicable here. I don't know if it, anyway, I don't know if this is the right spot, but we haven't, so the requirement for a land management plan doesn't look like those costs would be eligible under this, under the list, as at least I'm reading it, and maybe it's in there somewhere. But if it is a requirement of the program, anyway, that's a cost that isn't currently wrapped in. I don't know if that was intentional, and maybe something to consider. So, and maybe it's in there and I didn't see it.
It's a good catch, Robin. I guess I would pose this question to you around due diligence baseline. Should we add in another line related to management plan cost?
I think Michelle's point that if it's a requirement of the program to be developed, then it could be a covered cost.
Yep, thanks for that, Michelle. Daniel.
Yeah, another flag is there's a couple times where it notes staff time as a cost and a match. And I'm wondering, some of these folks are contracting out some of that capacity, so maybe staff or contractor time. Again, that might be diving too deep into the weeds, but I think that it would be helpful because, that's projects we've been involved in the past is kind of supporting the capacity needs of smaller water districts. And I'm sure we're not the only ones. I know we're not the only ones.
Yeah, and I think this is where we try to cross bucket honestly to how we think about it in the OWEB budget. So staff costs are for the grantee. You'll see down farther, there's reference to if the project is being completed as part of an official partnership. So for example, water supplier working with a land trust, then the costs associated with that partner, with that holder, are eligible for inclusion in that.
So Renee, would that also include though what Daniel's referencing? Because like Sustainable Northwest would not necessarily be a holder that a water supplier would be in partnership with, potentially, but they would be providing capacity expertise in form of contracting. So that would be contracted services and they could pay through staff costs.
And I think, yeah, so it would be through contracted services. I think what we'll need to be mindful of is, would that fit in due diligence? Or
Yeah,
is it, yeah, go ahead.
I guess it could, right? Like, I think that it's all kind of part of establishing the acquisition conversation and other due diligence. So yeah, I think it kind of all fits under that fourth tab.
I do think for OWEB stuff, let's check that back against how we normally think or how we historically have thought about due diligence to make sure that we're not precluding a relationship like that. But then on the flip, and Daniel, I'm going to use Sustainable Northwest because you happen to mention this just in the example I'm saying, also making sure we have a bright enough line that it's clear, like it is attached to this project, rather than, kind of more general collaboration. I think that's the piece that we'll need to make sure there's enough clarity about the connection back to the project in that case of how we're thinking about due diligence activities, or if we need to specify something about staff and contractor costs, but have a more explicit attachment to the project. All right, Kristen, go ahead.
Just on the same topic, for the water systems that don't have staff and are board led, the in-kind costs of the board volunteer hours, that would be the akin to the staff time, but would be a different, way to say it.
Yep. So I think, Audrey, on that one, can you scroll back? That's going to be an interesting one to capture. But we need to find a way to capture it. Thank you, Kristen, for flagging that. Just the volunteer time of the board related to the project itself. Okay.
Well, we have in-kind contributions to activities listed under this. Would it be, because volunteer board members their time is in-kind contributions, so.
Any time referenced in that use of grant is all called staff time. So it just could potentially be slightly confusing because it says staff time costs.
Could we change staff to personnel? Because that would encompass pretty much anyone that's working on behalf of, it doesn't have to be the staff. And then we could just say personnel of the, like, working, something like that. Because I think if we start getting into this listing the different types of, then we could inadvertently leave out someone, but also just end up with a really wonky.
Can't we just say administrative time?
No, I think that would raise a flag about, are we paying for basic operating of the water supplier? So Robin, I hear you on not laundry listing, and we need to make sure that it is not just staff time relative to the matching funds. Okay. All right, so in terms of what we've heard so far, thanks for the flag on the management plan development. I think we need to spend some time thinking through how the use of funds captures a partnership that may not be a formal partnership and holder, but they are very important to that project. So we'll look at that language, and then making sure that as it relates in particular to the matching contribution section, that we encompass volunteer boards because of their critical nature for water supply organizations. And knowing we will further dissect the use of funds, but hopping back up to matching funds based on the conversation thus far. Thoughts
Renee,
about
would
it?
this be a good time to pop in some of Anne's comments from my phone call yesterday?
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, awesome. So like Renee said, Anne Velisis from Port Orford provided some written comments, and then I had a follow-up conversation with her on the phone yesterday. And she's another voice in favor of lower match requirements, thinking of the smaller communities. And then she had a really good question. They received a loan from the state revolving fund, and it's half forgivable. And so is that forgiven half of the grant of the loan considered, does it fit into the match options? So those are the 2 points for me and to bring into the conversation.
Thanks for that, Audrey. And in terms of that latter part, when OWEB staff just briefly talked about that, we realized it doesn't really fall into C, the donated portion of a sale. But to Anne's point, we need to have a way to capture that because it seems like this will not be an unusual situation potentially for water suppliers coming into this program. So a way to capture that as a matching fund. So we literally just talked about it right before this call. So we haven't come up with language for that, but that is something we'll be working on. Kristen.
I guess two questions or comments on that. One, there's, I think, the point of the tie to the particular project. So I'm not familiar with Anne's water systems loan and forgivable loan, but I think the point being made that whatever it is it's tied directly to or maybe that's a policy question, sort of back to John's point. Is it something that's tied directly to the drinking water source protection piece, or is there a larger umbrella of water system efforts that can count as match? And then as apart from the forgivable loan piece, maybe not counting as the donated portion of sale on the actual loan, I mean, the water system they're making payments on that loan. So they are putting their own money into the payment of the loan on the other half, which is a financial contribution of theirs to whatever that particular project is. So I wonder if it's the flip side of that question is, they are making payments toward a project.
Yeah, I think, Kristen, to the first piece, I don't, and that's why I asked the question of Julie and you. We typically, and from having been a grantee, consider match as it has to be attached to the project. And we will have to be thinking about that related to bond funding. I think, John, to your point about how do you get it, like the bigger system needs, I do wonder if we handle that not in terms of match, and partly we address that by not having a ridiculously high match amount, but we do ask questions about that in the application, like how does this fit in the larger water supplier solution for addressing water scarcity or water quality concerns or infrastructure considerations through time, so that it's not a direct one-to-one, because I do think we'll need some time to talk through that, but almost kind of setting the table for maybe in future rule revisions, we could capture that differently around some of the gray infrastructure. But thoughts on that or any pushback?
I'm wrestling with the gray infrastructure in that typically source water protection we have really limited to being protecting that water quality before it hits an intake or a well, not improving your treatment system so that you can treat it better just because the water quality is poor. So I'm really hesitant to bring gray infrastructure into the question because that's not source water protection at that point.
Thanks for that context, Julie. John, go ahead.
Well, I'm fine with that. And I just have a different comment, actually not related to gray infrastructure. In OWEB's acquisition program, matching contribution also includes, let's say, an adjacent piece of property can be used as match. Say you bought a piece of property like a year prior, or you're buying adjacent piece of property at that time, and you can use that adjacent piece of property's value as match. I don't necessarily see that as an option in this.
That's an interesting flag, John. Robin, any insights on that from OHP or your work on land acquisition? I think I'm not opposed to that, probably, as long as it would connect back to the source water area. I hadn't thought about having that in as a possibility. But Robin, thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've done it that way in land acquisition. We also administer it though to where that piece of property has to pretty much meet all the other requirements of land acquisition. So it has to be, like, it can be purchased through other funds, but we need to have it being serving the same purposes. And so I think we'd just have to add more in here than just being able to state that the cost of another property.
Yeah, I
So
would be fine with
Robin,
that. As long as it, like, you know, there will be properties that were purchased before even say this program came out. And could that be eligible for match as part of this? And is there a look back period on that? And if so, what would that be? I mean, those sort of things, because say like if take like Nescoin and they just bought a piece of property for, you know, $100,000, they got a donated portion. It would qualify for this. It's going to be used for all the same reasons as this. Could they use like a prior acquisition as match?
and Robin, what you're describing is in terms of details about that property, like needing to have more of that built into the application if it's being used as match.
I believe so. And I think also the restrictions then later placed on the property, the match property. But I'm not entirely
Okay.
clear.
Okay. And I do think this is where, so John, thanks for that flag. I think that's important for us to look back at and recognizing that we're now in this situation where we have a number of different land acquisition programs at OWEB. We can look to some helpful pieces, and each one has different statutory underpinnings. So I think figuring out where it makes sense to port over, where some things may not apply, and where there could be some flexibility on that. Okay. So we've done a good job of, I think, exploring maybe some additions in terms of eligible match contributions. So like volunteer board time. I think John's suggestion of potentially adjacent property. I do think we probably need to think harder about the gray infrastructure, given the language in the bill and what Julie flagged about source water protection versus other. Loan forgiveness, exploring that. I think the question though still to the group is, what are your thoughts about a match percent?
It seems like the 15% that Washington uses meets a lot of the things that we've been talking about.
Thoughts from others? Kristen?
Would you even go as low as 10%?
Michelle?
My brain was going to 10 too, so I'll just give a plug for 10. And I was, crunching some numbers, and depending on the cost of the property, $100,000 can be, I know it's cost prohibitive for some communities to raise on their own and could be difficult. So I think the lower the better to my mind, as just a kind of rule requirement to make it accessible for the communities. I think the legislation intended it to be accessible for, so.
Sean?
I think as low as this group is comfortable with.
I have a question. I can't raise my hand while screen sharing that I can find, so sorry for just jumping in. Steve, do you have a quick back of the envelope guess of how many hours your board members spent on getting to your projective instrument?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, and it wasn't board members, it was me. And I probably spent in total probably a good 40 hours going back and forth, a full week in going back and forth with the attorney and the various different loan entities, the bridge loan, the Craft 3 people, the co-bank people, the Clackamas County Bank people, filling out the paperwork for the drinking water revolving loan emergency fund that we got. I'd say the better part of 40 hours of my time, volunteer time, went to put this whole thing together.
Okay, thanks for that. That was just to kind of give us context for like, we know the size of rhododendrons acquisition or their protective instrument, and just to get an idea of like how much in-kind time went into that, because we might want to consider for some of these smaller communities, like what match percentage could they meet if we're looking at only in kind and no cash coming to the table. So another thought to consider in getting to a number.
So thus far, we've heard a few folks advocating for 10%. I think given the question that Audrey posed, is it worth contemplating something as low as 5% while being mindful? I think, Dan, you raised it. You know, this was intended to help leverage other funding, but in the spirit of trying to be as accessible as possible, 10%, 5%?
I'm good with
Kristen?
10. I'm good with 10 to 15%.
Okay. Kristen?
I guess I'll defer to the volunteer board member over there, but I mean, it's super hard to meet match just with volunteer board time. I mean, you know, 40 hours at say $30, $35 an hour valued. I mean, that's less than $2,000 in kind time. And you're trying to, even on theirs, you're talking $17,000 in match at 10% needed. So, you know, unless you start calculating legal fees and the others that go into it, it's pretty dang hard to hit a match requirement with volunteer time only.
So Eric Hartstein, I think maybe a question for you. Do we contemplate maybe something in either the 5 or 10% range as a starting point, recognizing that we will probably fairly quickly have some learnings from this entire program, and contemplating if needed, reopening the rule set sooner than we typically would on that 5-year cycle?
Yeah, that's a important question, Renee, and that's and it gets to our Division 5, our kind of our grant program rules, like that you alluded to earlier, have kind of a lot of flexibility in match and state that it's essentially at the time of the offering, OWEB can determine what that match amount can be. So we could, in these rules, have a 5%, 10%, you know, but we could also say, based on the discussion with the RAC, that it is really kind of informing that 5 or 10% to start with at the offering level, and that would be in guidance too. And then we could much more easily adjust that as we learn more. So we have, I think, a couple different options here.
So given what Eric just described, would the group be comfortable with aligning with that division the existing Division 5 OWEB rules of it will be a staff determination at the time of the cycle. Knowing we would take into account this input and feedback, or is the preference to go ahead and set it to provide a bit more certainty from the outset? Daniel?
Also, one of the things we mentioned before is that you don't want someone coming with a project that has more match scoring more highly. So if we were to proceed as Eric is saying is possible with making it an OWEB decision on a per project basis, I think that there needs to be pretty clearly defined that projects won't necessarily score more highly because they have a higher match. And all that to say, I kind of agree, a lower match of 5% or 10% would still signify that match is being leveraged. And, the effort is being made to pursue multiple funding sources. So that's just something, I guess, I don't want to make it more difficult here, but just want to make sure that there's not there's not subjectivity between different projects based on not having a match cap.
Yeah, and just to clarify, it's not that it would be determined by each application coming in the door at the time of opening the offering for the drinking water source protection. In the program guidance, we would say there's a 5% match or the 10% or a 15%. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
Yep, absolutely.
That makes sense.
Yep. But thanks for flagging the subjectivity. That is something we really try to avoid having introduced into any solicitation. Kristen, go ahead, and then Dan.
I think for OWEB staff sanity and maybe applicants too, just setting something might be cleaner now rather than trying to wait and in guidance and have you captured the spirit of the RAC conversation or whatever as you go through that, and just giving applicants some certainty. And then I'm no lawyer, but in the statute, I'm just looking at the statute in that it does say setting forth the amount of matching funds a grant application must provide to be eligible in terms of the rules to be developed. So I don't know if we need to set a number anyway, but I would think as an applicant, you just kind of want to know upfront people are planning these multiple cycles ahead, and then the next cycle it changes and you're like, oh, I was planning based on the guidance from last cycle, so that's my thought.
Thanks, Kristen. Dan?
Yeah, I don't know whether to weigh in as sort of a federal person here on the state match, but I do feel like, if a community has more to match, then they're gonna put that forward. We see that across other sort of OWEB grants, I think, like some people have the ability to leverage a lot of resources to help them achieve their goals. In some communities, they have very, very little resources, and they don't even have the capacity necessarily to work with other partners to get a more broad reach for match. And so I would just sort of suggest thinking about keeping it pretty low, maybe even closer to the 5%, my opinion. Thinking that, communities that have more capacity, broader partnerships, have better ways to leverage, will do that. And those communities who have very limited capacity and very limited resources will probably struggle to meet a 5% match. Just my thoughts.
Thanks, Dan. Super helpful. Julie?
And I'm struggling just a little bit because I know that when we look at, I'm pretty sure that within the Safe Drinking Water Act, when we're looking at the loan provision within the set aside funds, that we look at sort of ability to pay and their rate, the way their rates are set, and if that is in accordance with sort of what the community can bear also. So there's also this whole concept of, there's a lot of water systems that like to keep their rates low, even though maybe the community can could pitch in more. So I don't know how you wrap that into this, but I just want to throw that out there as another sort of wrinkle in this, is that some communities will say they don't want to take on additional rates, but the financial analysis says that they could, pull that together also.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And I do, not trying to overcomplicate this, because I do think we just, if the inclination of the RAC is to go ahead and set in rule a number so that folks know what they're aiming for. But I do think, to your point, like there are those considerations about the descriptors of the community, and asking sufficient questions in the application to get at what are they facing, and on the flip, when might maybe choosing to do some things that benefit folks who were not necessarily the aim of this program. Okay. So I think it's time to call the question, just to keep us moving. I think we've heard 10% multiple times. We've heard 5% a few times. I'm not going to ask you to, this is not a vote, but inclination of the group if we're setting a number in rule, which I do think that we heard. Start conservative with 5. Michelle?
Yeah, I'm just jumping in. Lower is better. So whatever OWEB is comfortable with.
Okay. John says 5. Any concerns if we set it at 5? Knowing we will have lots of opportunities for learning from this program. Okay. Okay, Eric Hartstein, if we're going the 5% route, we'll need to build in the notwithstanding to differentiate from Division 5.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that discussion. I know it took a while, and it's an important one, just so we are, I think, adhering to the spirit of what was intended with the program. So I think we did capture some great feedback on, I think, be as open-minded as possible on what qualifies as match contribution. So we will do some work on that. Any other questions or suggestions that we've not already discussed related to qualified match contributions? All right, hearing none, let's go down to application requirements. So much of the editing that you see here really is just clarification based on some of those previous adjustments, like the protective instrument, the connection back to the drinking water source area. All right, and Audrey, you want to talk us through that question that's in?
Yeah, and real quick before we do that, if we should double check throughout the entire document now, how things align with tribal lands. So I'll just make a note here because that jumps out at me, using the capitalized drinking water source area. So it may even be something where we go back to the definition or something. So I'll just flag that. But this question was one actually that preceded me. So it might be a Robin or Rachel one to talk through. That was from the leftover questions that we didn't get to last time.
I can jump in here maybe. I think this was getting at whether some of these pieces belong in the application requirements or the evaluation criteria or both, which is kind of currently how we have it. But if there's some RAC input in terms of, for instance, like 5 and 6, those are some pretty specific pieces that we're requesting in the application itself for applicants to provide in the application. Do we want to leave that broader in this section and have that be an evaluation criteria? So just input on that. But before, I saw Dan had his hand up, and I would guess it's not related to this piece, so I'll pause.
It actually is a very, very minor, I think, typo correction in 5B. Property proximity to drinking water intake and confirmation of location. Should that be within drinking water source area? That's all.
Thanks, Dan.
And then I think you have to also capture there that, like, not necessarily percent, but not that it's that the whole
Right.
property doesn't have to be within. So you have to capture both the tribal and that other piece of the conversation. There's two previous parts of the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Gabby.
I wanted to share a comment kind of on the application eligibility versus evaluation. I do think that putting some of these more in the evaluation category would be helpful. For 5A and 6A, I can reach out to some of our grant folks for language. I've heard, although I don't directly relate to I don't directly work with them in this capacity, that there are sometimes challenges for water system operators to provide that legal documentation, and they've developed some specific language to help capture that complexity. So I can reach out to them and maybe provide some of that example language to support that. And similarly, I would advocate for language in the groundwater source areas that mirrors the more general description of land uses or activities that pose significant threat to water quality. I wonder if the groundwater source areas, keeping that C, D, and E within the eligibility would preclude many properties from being involved unless they're already listed as like a cleanup site in DEQ's database. And if that's the intent, then maybe that should remain, but I don't believe that would be the intent. And then thirdly, I asked the question in email, but I just wanted to bring out to the group that if the intent of the grant program would also include flow protection, as in quantity in addition to quality, I think this eligibility criterion would also limit that activity.
Gabby, let me ask a follow-up before we go to Julie so that I'm clear. So we did respond that, yes, broadly, our understanding is the intent of the legislation was to get at both water quality consideration for source water areas and water availability, so flow. But when you say flow protection, are you meaning a WRD administrative process for like a lease or a transfer? Is that what you're talking about?
I believe that we already have grant programs that may overlap, and I would be cautious to put in rule something that might lead to a perception of enlargement. I know that's not the intent of this program.
Got it.
But I just
Okay.
That would be something to caution as well.
Yes.
And I can
to avoid scrolling a ton, where was the flow protection piece that you referenced?
I don't think it's explicitly in the rules now. I think towards one of the use of grant funds, there's language around restoration or protection. And I think that could be interpreted as both restoration and protection of flow volumes and of quality. But I don't think in the eligibility now, as written now, the eligibility doesn't read like it would include activities that support flow quantity. The eligibility reads now as if it only deals with quality, water quality.
And I think we probably, so Gabby, thanks for further elaborating on this. I think we need to be pretty explicit that, and Eric Hartzine, check me on this since you were in more of these legislative conversations, but I think related to water quantity, it wasn't suggesting that this would engage with the WRD administrative process and run a risk of somehow getting crosswise with other water rights. It was thinking about if you can keep systems parcels protected, their hydrologic function may be better, and hence they may have better storage capacity for kind of longer season releases. But Eric Hartstein, I guess that is my thinking on the link to water quantity. It's not suggesting, like, you know, when Gabby raised the issue of enlargement, we're not talking about a flow restoration program akin to our water acquisition program.
Right.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I think that's captures the spirit behind the legislation and what was discussed during during the legislative process.
Okay. So Gabby, we may follow up just to make sure that things are really clear on that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Julie, and then I think Michelle had her hand up.
Yeah, and then I just popped in the chat some language that we might want to add to get at having applicants identify sort of what they're addressing by doing this as opposed to priority pollutants. And this is our language out of the source water protection grants that we use. So this could be modified, but this is a suggestion that description of which priority pollutants are addressed and how the proposed grant activity reduces that risk or pollutant load. And then to Abby's question below, especially on it's 6, and I think I got my thing in the way. I would change that to potential release. So D, I would change to potential release. There were 2 of them. And in C, activities that potentially release contamination, given that the purpose of this is source water protection. It's not necessarily addressing known issues. It's addressing potential releases and minimizing that harm to the watershed or the aquifer.
Thank you for that. Michelle, did you have something?
Julie just covered my groundwater one, just the proactive nature of source water protection. So not requiring a demonstration that contamination has already occurred. And then to Gabby's point, and you captured it, but just I think the stabilization of quantity and that storage capacity. So I don't want to run into like formal in-stream flow programs, but I think allowing that to be a benefit from these projects is an important piece. And I don't know that has to be in rule language, but I think not saying that people can't point to that as a benefit just because it has a work quantity in it, I think to my mind is important. And then the other piece is kind of a small one, but 7 says must provide the source water assessment. And it's capitalized, so that suggests to me that would point back to the DEQ kind of formal and just the tribal link again, maybe. And it's not defined. So anyway, I didn't see it defined. So clarifying that.
Yeah, we'll do a wholesale review to make sure that revision we made above is reflected throughout and we don't have mismatches. Thanks for that,
And
Michelle.
Michelle, that echoes something that Anne brought up in her comments. I just wanted we have this in here, this question about source water assessment already. So that's 2 people noting that. And we did want to pick Julie's brain about how we could approach this better.
Yeah. Let me follow up on that. There's definitely I mean, we did all the source water assessments in accordance with EPA rule as to what had to be in there. There's certain pieces and parts, and then each state can pick their pieces and parts. And so let me find a better in accordance with language for that piece.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Kristen, go ahead.
I think following up on the source water assessment piece, I guess if there's, you know, the way to provide it, like, or a link to, or identified document number or whatever, like not attaching however big it is. And then Julie, I don't know, I mean, rather than just providing it, is there a way to create a link to it of like, and stating how this acquisition of this protective instrument will contribute to reducing risk identified in the source water assessment? Like not just saying, yeah, we have one, but how the application deals with anything called out in it, rather than just saying, yeah, there's one.
And that ties directly back to the like, how are you reducing risk within the drinking water source area? Yeah. And then that would become part of the evaluation criteria as well, but you want them to tell you, what you want.
Yeah.
I had another item that was not related to the source water assessment, so I'm happy to pause if others want to chime in on that topic. Or I'll keep going.
Yep,
Okay.
go for it.
Okay. In number 3, if a water supplier will form a partnership with a holder, there's description of partnership resources and whether your missions align. I'm not sure how these arrangements are normally set up, or if OWEB already has rules or standards around this relationship. Is there, I would look for, or is there consideration on having already some formal agreement between the water system and the holder in terms of roles and responsibilities, and outlined, yeah, we're agreed to this, both our boards or the city council and the so-and-so said, we're committed to this, we have this partnership, we say the whole, you know, we're the applicant and the holder will hold the easement and they're responsible for this, and just outlining those roles and responsibilities seems pretty important leading into a perpetual, you know, an agreement in perpetuity.
Yeah, Kristen, thanks for that. And it would be wonderful to get some feedback from John, Stephanie, Daniel, like in practice, how is this working? Because something like what Kristen described, we require that documented relationship and partnership structure in some of our programs. It can make very good sense. So we have certainty. And is it going too far? I don't know how this is typically structured. So yeah, go for it, John.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know about the requirements of the program, but typically what we would do is sign an MOU with, say, the water district or a contract or something to that effect that sort of memorializes roles, responsibilities in the partnership going forward. And I think that's just a good business practice generally to do. So whether or not it's required, you know, maybe it's in the review, like what is the strength of the partnership? Have there been sort of formal agreements? Or like, you know, how loose is this partnership, or how strong is it in the review process?
Let me scroll up to the partnership definition real quick. I think that can help inform the conversation.
Thanks,
Because that
Audrey.
could be where we may need to provide clarity if it doesn't meet what we're talking about. There it is.
Daniel?
Yes. So, I mean, John and NCLC do a great job kind of establishing MOUs to start a lot of these collaborations. With Sustainable Northwest, we've kind of looked towards, has there been any like formal vote of a city council or of a water district to confirm their intention of both working to acquire a watershed area and working with, you know, Sustainable Northwest or another conservation partner. So I think this kind of fits well, that it's some type of formal, have it in writing, have it in a public facing documentation, public facing meeting.
Okay. I would say maybe Steve and Stephanie, as you're hearing that those comments about having something formalized could be very helpful here. And this is about the partnership context. Any concerns from a water supplier standpoint?
No, not really at all, because, well, first of all, if we're going to embark on something like this, and what I'm working on right now is getting just that, our source water protection plan approved and adopted by council, and then our acquisition management, our acquisition plan, whatever that turns out to be, something that actually we're asking for a grant money to do an outreach to our citizens and to our because there's our ratepayers. I mean, because our ratepayers are the ones that are going to be, you know, essentially funding projects in the watershed. They need to understand that relationship, as well as the city council needs to feel like it's a more of a grassroots movement. So it's almost, to me, essential that you've got some kind of formal, yeah, everyone's on board with this. Otherwise, if you're just the lone public works director going after this, that's not going to work. So, and it's really pretty straightforward. And I like the, I mean, like Daniel said, or, even a council, adoption, but then certainly if you're going to partner with a land trust or something, then you would want at least an MOU. So I think it's pretty, fine. I think it's a good, reasonable thing to require.
Okay.
And I concur. Since ours is already done and we formed no partnership, this is really a moot point as far as we're concerned. But for people that are going after this funding to do what we have already done, if they want to form a partnership with the landowner and or the entity, more power to them.
Okay, thanks for that conversation. We are a few minutes past the anticipated time for a break. It does not appear, Eric Hartstein, double check me, no one else has jumped on to join for public comment.
No,
Okay.
there's no one else on.
Okay. So question to the group, do you want a 5-minute break and then restart, or do you want to power through for 26 more minutes? Either is fine.
I say power through.
Kristen says break. Okay. All right, 5-minute break. How about that? 11:40, come back. We'll see how far we can get. Okay, thanks everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. Before we jump back to the rules, I know Steve has to leave a bit early, and OWEB staff were having a little Teams chat. We think we're looking at a RAC meeting number 6. Wanted to get that on your radar. I do think there are a set of things laid in the rules that will go relatively quickly, and we have not touched evaluation criteria in any meaningful way yet. So I do think that what OWEB staff can do before the next meeting is lean in a little bit on putting some more straw content in that, based on some of the feedback we've gotten at past meetings. But what we don't want to do is plan for only 5 meetings. The last one is a significant lift on evaluation criteria, and we're not able to look at the rule set as a package. So Eric Hartstein, I think that meeting would need to happen before the end of April in order to adhere to our rulemaking timeline. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess any concerns from RAC members or unavailability that we should know about before we start reaching out about potential dates? Okay, seeing none. So thanks for your understanding on that. We guessed we would need 5, and we guessed incorrectly. Hopefully the last meeting can be a bit short. So look for outreach on that. Let's go ahead and jump back over. We do have about 18 minutes left. We could probably still make progress. Audrey, if you could screen share again. Can you scroll up just a tad? Yep. Okay. So we've had good conversation about application requirements. I do want to draw your attention to number 9 on the screen right now. So this is in the spirit of what we heard during the last RAC meeting from several folks, and chimed in also, beginning to signal that there will need to be an explanation for if projects are less than perpetual, and that will also be addressed down in the evaluation criteria. But just again, for transparency's purposes, it's not then that something that is not perpetual can't come in the door, but just being clear on there will be a requirement around rationale justification, given the intent of the program around source water protection. So wanted you all to see that we had added that in. So I guess any questions on that or any other comments on application requirements? Michelle.
I didn't have a chance to scroll up and look, but technically a conservation easement doesn't have to be perpetual. And I don't know if OWEB defines conservation easement as perpetual, but it may, like for coverage sake, it may be that a conservation easement is proposed that's not perpetual, and you may want to reword the language, unless there is a definition in OWEB's rules that defines conservation easement as perpetual, like in Division 5 or something that I haven't seen. So just flagging that nuance.
Yeah, thanks for flagging that. And I don't think for so it's not in Division 5, I know. And did we?
We have a definition here that I highlighted.
But it doesn't say, yeah, go ahead, Robin.
We do have it as a requirement under protective instruments for an easement that or a conservation easement has to be perpetual.
Okay. Thanks, Robin. All right, so other comments, feedback on application requirements? Yep, Kristen?
The section 8A and B, and I imagine this is getting to the requirements that the serving rural communities experience lower incomes. And I don't have a well formulated thought, but just some of this feels vague, or where OWEB is going to receive potentially things or information or responses that don't provide for apples to apples, I guess, in terms of water systems. I'm also curious about seasonal variations in drinking water users due to drought. And I'm not familiar. I actually ran this section past John Unger because I just flagged for his feedback, and he also wasn't familiar with that. So I don't know if that's a thing where people leave, like vacate the system because of insufficient, the users actually go down because of drought. Anyway, was just one question, but wondering about how you'd get to that, or what data is out there that could maybe standardize how people are addressing this and minimize the burden of applicants to know what it is being sought and how it's going to be used, and how the reviewers would compare that to get apples to apples.
Yeah, let me start a response to the first part, which I think this was our attempt to be sensitive to really great input from the RAC about some of the ways that you would access data and harvest data to quickly get at this are not as nuanced as they need to be to reflect the reality in some communities. And so starting to send a signal of expectations around community characteristics, but not holding so firm to any one piece. I absolutely hear what you're saying, Kristen. And so I think input, other thoughts from the OWEB team about how to thread this needle. Like we will have more precise application questions, and will that solve it? Maybe not still, but I would like to give the OWEB team a chance to chime in on this. And then also on the drought addition there, that parenthetical, I don't remember. So I need to lean on one of my colleagues to help me remember why that was added. So I don't know, Rachel, Robin, Audrey, or Christine.
Yeah, I think on the drought related piece for A, that probably should be differentiated out from the seasonal variations, because I think they are two distinct things. And Eric Hartstein might be able to jump in about some of this, because I think the drought piece was something that came out during the legislative testimony parts of this bill, but recognizing that in some coastal areas, drought is impacting the availability of their water supply. And that is also impacted further when they have seasonal tourism, but they are kind of two distinct things. So, and I don't even know, having kind of a parenthetical like example piece might not be the best thing to have in rule anyway, but I think that's a great point about trying to make that a little bit more clear. So thanks for bringing that up. For the B portion, Renee, I think, hit it exactly. There was a lot of early discussion in the first two RAC meetings, I believe, where it was hard to kind of, existing tools really lean heavily on census block data, and that was not ideal, I think, for a lot of folks on this RAC meeting. Just it does lose, you lose a little bit of information when you're looking at that kind of broad level of data. So this is attempting to get at that. But I think if there are examples, or if there's other ways to think about this, we are definitely ears for that. And I guess I'll also just say, I know there is a initiative for the state to be putting together an environmental justice mapping tool that is still a couple years out, is our understanding. And so I think this could be something that changes in future iterations of rulemaking. But I think the thought was here to, until we have something that's more concrete at the state level, to kind of keep this broad, was the thinking on this one.
Yeah, comments from other OWEB staff. And then Julie, before I go to you, Daniel, you had your hand up. and then took it down. Do you want to chime in here before we go to Julie?
Yeah, just, I was wondering if maybe drought being noted there had anything to do with some of these community water supplies being emergency water supplies for neighboring communities. So like maybe if a neighboring community's water supply is impacted by drought or something else, then they're reliant as, the drinking water supply of the area that we're talking about. They're reliant on them to be their backup water. So maybe, I'm wondering if maybe that had something to do with it. But if not, yeah, definitely we'd want to highlight the impact of drought that it will have on water supply.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So we'll huddle internally about the why behind this, I think, and figure out maybe a clearer way to get at it. And I think agree with Rachel. Maybe a parenthetical isn't the way to go, but figuring out how do we get at some of these stacked exacerbating situations, and maybe it's not in rule and more something we build into program materials in terms of like suggested approach.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I missed the first rack, but I remember the second rack, and maybe this is where Julie's going, the coastal communities, that if you just said, give me your population, obviously there's that influx demand, but yeah.
Go ahead, Julie.
Yep. No, that's exactly it. And it may not even be the term drought. It may be just low water supply, because many of them have moratoriums on development. So it's really impacting their economy because they don't have enough water to grow at all. So maybe we pull that in. And then on that B part, it seems like that is a place for the guidance or the application materials to specify what they want, but that this is fine for the rule base.
Okay, great discussion. Thank you for that. All right, I think then anything else on application requirements? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to propose an executive decision, which probably does not make it an executive decision. I'm asking for input on it, and it doesn't feel as though we should jump into use of grant funds with 8 minutes left. Because we've touched on it, you have a little bit of background. Or Karstine saying thumbs up, there's still a lot there. That said, any concerns with that? Okay. I think I would ask that you do please take a look at this section. We will start here. And I've already mentioned we are in a bifurcated situation because of the two fund sources that have some differences. And there are some things that we're still working through. So for example, like, what do we say about appraisal and valuation? How do we handle indirect costs? We're still gathering information, partly because lottery bond is a new fund source for the agency. So you may see a few things change in the next version, but just please start orienting yourself to this. And there are things like the way that we've referenced the tax code that is very different from anything we've ever done in OWEB rule. And we're still working through with DAS and DOJ what's the right way to do this because of bond funding. And then we also will spend time internally trying to put some more meat on the bones of the evaluation criteria in the hopes of expediting the conversation. But we will really spend a lot of time in those two sections during the next meeting, and we'll be scoping a 6th meeting. Deanne, go ahead.
Just a quick point of clarification on the use of grant funds. So I get why this is in the rule, but OWEB isn't expecting applicants to sort of, when they submit an application, they're just, here's our project. In other words, they're not going to need to go through all this and figure out which piece is funding which part of their application. Is that right?
They won't have to figure out which pieces are what fund sources funding which parts. The things that we do have, there are some really key pieces. So for example, in this first grant cycle, I mean, Steve actually said, we'll be coming in. We don't know what the backlog is. And we know that loan repayment is highly limited in terms of lottery bond funding. So there will be a lot of pressure on those general funds. So in program materials, we will describe things like loan repayment. Please focus attention here. Reach out to OWEB staff to talk through questions that you have. So from that standpoint, and then other things like indirect, we're still getting clear on if that can only come out of general fund or if lottery bond can be used for that. So there will be things that we will try as much as possible to have that be internal thinking and figuring out among OWEB, but I think we do have to be proactive in helping folks to understand that the draw on general fund may be very heavy in the first cycle, and we will probably need to prioritize some things. But we won't ask them to say like, yes, lottery bond, yes, general fund. That's unfair to do to applicants.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah. Michelle.
Sorry, just a clarification on what you said. Is it possible then, are you thinking that a project could be funded by both lottery and general funds? Like it could be, I don't know how that would work, but anyway, your answer prompted me to think if that's feasible.
We would
likely.
We would love to avoid that. And I'm going to use indirect as an example. Let's say general fund in the first cycle is not needed to fund projects that fall outside of eligibility for lottery bond. So if we find out that indirect is not an eligible cost, absolutely not an eligible cost for lottery bond funding, what we would contemplate as an agency is, can that portion of a budget be funded with general fund? Because we understand how resource constrained what these applicants and frankly their partners may be. So we would love to have it be one or the other, and we recognize there may be situations depending on eligibility where it has to be both. Yeah. And we have done that before with other grant types. Lottery bond is different for us though. So we're thinking of also about like the back end financial tracking that we'll need to do. So thank you, Steve, for being on. He may have already jumped off. So folks, we'll be in touch about scheduling a 6th meeting. Anything else either from RAC members that you'd like to flag for discussion next time, or OWEB staff, anything we should flag for RAC members to be prepared for at the next meeting?
Yeah, Renee, I was just gonna scroll through real quick and highlight a couple of comments for people to think about for the next meeting.
Okay.
So this is the only one on the use of grant funds, really just, is it clear the differentiation between bond and general fund? It's probably one of the most confusing parts of the rules. And then we talked about diving deeper into evaluation criteria, but do these make sense to the applicant? Like, is there anything that's just like, what are you asking for? So think about that. And then technical criteria we need to flesh out, but if folks have ideas on that. And then let's see, we brought in management plans here. So that's another big one. We had a long discussion at the last meeting about that. So really think about, so I put the questions in here, is this the right location to bring up management plans? And then does this address what we're looking for? We left room for like, maybe a management plan isn't required for some types of protective instruments. And then obviously we've got some edits and grant agreement conditions. And then I think the other comments are, this wording was confusing, so we're going to work on that for number 2 here in distribution of funds. And then just a note that subgrantees can be reimbursed, but via grantees, just like in any other OWEB program. Yeah, so that's the extent of the comments remaining in the document to think about next time.
Thanks for that, Audrey. Super helpful. Kristen?
Just, I won't be able to be at the next one. I'll be at a conference and out of town, so I'll send anything in writing like Ann did today, or have a phone call or something if that's okay. And I apologize for that.
Absolutely. You just let us know. Happy to jump on the phone. Our next meeting is scheduled for 9 to noon on Thursday the 4th, and then we'll scope dates hopefully within the next week or two, honestly, after that. So thanks everyone. So appreciate this RAC. Just excellent conversation, really good thinking. We couldn't do this without you. Great, take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.